Hey everyone, welcome to another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. We are finally starting the, as I've titled it, the OTD Normandy month. I've been planning this for, I don't even know how long, since February. It's been a while, maybe early March, can't remember exactly. So this one's been on my mind a lot this whole month, and all the different speakers I've got lined up. I think there's 12. I can't remember exactly. It's quite a fair number. Some of the details have been released. Some I've teased out a little bit more here and there. Just haven't had the time to get it all up and running yet. That'll be very soon. Planning to get some more up today and hopefully tomorrow as well. So stay tuned for that. Already some of them are already up. And just off the top here, have another one tomorrow at this exact same time with Kevin Lambie about the Regina rifles on D-Day and D+1. So that'll be a good one. So be sure to come back and hang out with us again tomorrow. Today's topic is one I'm very interested in. A topic that I talk about a lot, maybe too much, but so be it. But this is a different angle of looking at this whole story connected to Kurt Meyer and the whole 12th SS and the murder of the Canadians in Normandy, particularly those at the Abbaye Ardennes and all of that. That's going to be part of this. But as I kind of said, this is a new angle. This is a different way of looking at it, and looking at it from more of the Canadian perspective. This isn't just, SS fanaticism and, the whole out murder division thing and all that comes along with it. This is more than that. This is looking at an individual. This is taking a biographical approach, which I think is needed and it's fresh and it's new. So very excited to finally get, not any fault of hers, fault of mine, to get Taylor Coates, our guest today, on the channel. I've been wanting to do this for a while, and this just lined up perfectly, so I had to wait a little bit longer. But I'm really excited, and we'll get into kind of what Taylor did differently and why as we get moving here. So as usual, questions, comments, sidebar, fire away. Really anything, we'll do our best. But as you'll see, like I said, this is different. This isn't like Kurt Meyer. This isn't going over the details of the Abbaye. This isn't all of that. This is different. So, but we'll do our best and see what we got going with that. So, no further ado, we'll get this started.
Hi.
So, hi, Taylor. Thanks for coming on again. I really appreciate it. Like I said, it's been a while. It just hadn't got a chance to get it to fit or to get it all together. So I'm really happy to finally have you on.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited, like you said, to share this different approach to the trial that's incredibly important and also often overlooked, I think, in terms of international importance and even national importance in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, that's an angle I think gets forgotten. We'll get to what I keep alluding to, gotta keep them waiting a little bit, but as I said to you, and as people I'm sure are starting to notice, especially this next month, of how I start pretty much every live stream is, how did you come across this topic? Why are you looking at Bruce MacDonald, the Canadian prosecutor, and the Kurt Meyer trial? Like I said, that whole, and again, I don't have to tell you this, but just as a quick introduction, right? That whole 12th SS, the Panzer obsession, all that stuff gets so much attention, clouds the debate, all of that stuff. How'd you get here? How'd you get to this major debate? There's a historical debate that's been going on forever, and be like, I'm going to go along this road and then take a left-hand turn. How did you get here?
Yeah, so honestly, it wasn't exactly my first choice when entering into my master's. I actually was considering looking at military fashion.
Okay.
But my supervisor, Dr. Stephen Connor, he told me about, and I mean, I obviously learned about World War II history in my undergraduate years, but he kind of told me a little bit more about this trial, and I kind of took a step back and sat and thought about it, and I was like, well, why is all of this attention on the perpetrator? And why are we taking the memory of these victims of this atrocious crime and constantly tying that to the perpetrator, when in reality there's so many other, I would say, more important people to be looking at and to be understanding. And I think that by looking at MacDonald, it adds a whole other layer to the story that I really don't think many people knew about, because the digging that I had to do and the amount that MacDonald was left out of a lot of histories on the trial and the murders and everything. I was like, this man is incredibly important to this entire narrative, and I think it's something to really look into. And so I originally was like, I'm going to write a biography on this man, and then my supervisor sat me down and said, "Yeah, that's great, but we need a little more here." And so I was like,
Right.
yeah, you're not wrong. And so I
Yeah.
added in the gender part of it, and then added in the significance in regards to Canadian state identity post Confederation, and
Right.
it's this amalgamation of a lot. So yeah, that's kind of the path that I took, and I came up with this.
Yeah. I mean, it's. I think it's a great way to go about it, from the two angles, right? Like, again, I didn't get a chance to read all of it. I had to like skim and pick pieces out and
Mm.
everything. But those two angles, I think, are super interesting. And the fact that you did that in 100 pages, I'm just like, that is amazing. Like, that is, I'm just like, how? I did my dissertation for a PhD at 350, and I'm like, it's still not enough. Like, it's just, I was cramming at the end there, deleting like crazy.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
so with that said, well, just, yeah, so good on you. That is amazing. And
Thank you.
I want to dig into that, but I want to take, now that I'm just thinking of this, I think it's a good way to do it. Who is MacDonald? Can you tell us a bit about him? And because that's what you did, right? So
Yeah,
can you just kind of give us a little background on him?
yeah, absolutely. So I will start right at the beginning. This is what I'm good at.
Sure.
Timelines are my thing. So MacDonald was born in 1902 in Nova Scotia.
Okay.
He was a member of the Presbyterian Church. He goes to university for law. During his time in university, he's a member of the debate team, president of the law club, class president actually in 1926, and he loved to play golf in his spare time. So he graduates university. He joins a law firm in Windsor, Ontario, in 1927. In 1929, he starts service with the Essex Scottish Regiment. 1930, he becomes Windsor's first full-time solicitor. So
Oh,
that's incredible. Yep.
interesting.
1939, he gets married to a woman named Norma Millard, and then he's sent for overseas service. So September 1939, shortly after he gets married, he becomes the commander of C Company of the Essex Scottish. 1942, he becomes second in command of the regiment, and then later becomes commander of the 4th Brigade Battle School. So MacDonald he's doing great things already. And so a little bit about the Essex Scottish, because this will come into play later. Dieppe raid, 9 August 1942, they are demolished. They suffer 121 casualties. MacDonald is not there. He was sent to Canada at the time to be an instructor in a training course, so he missed that. However, because of the tight-knit community within the regiment, the bonds that you make, this is a devastating event. I mean, obviously it's a devastating event, period, but especially, for MacDonald, these are men that he bonded with. These are men that, he probably trained himself. He may have, begun service with these people. So immediately after Dieppe, there's rumors that began circulating that Germans shot wounded Canadians that had not yet been taken into captivity. So this is already, brewing. The pot is brewing. In May 1943, MacDonald assumes command of the regiment. He receives incredibly high praise as a very firm but kind commander. His men love him. He organizes a baseball tournament, actually, at one point with his men. Yep. This was written about in the Windsor Star.
Oh, yeah.
He,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, really fun, really interesting to see that
Yeah.
kind of different side.
Yeah.
Of the
Sorry, just to
military.
jump in there, but sorry, you're rolling there, but I have this has just come up before, right? Because I had a live stream with Craig Baird. I can't remember now, a couple months ago, and
Mhm.
it's probably longer than that now. We were talking about hockey and just obviously and like all that played and everything in the First World
Yeah,
War, and sports just come out. The baseball, it's just so fascinating how important this was to that. Like there's
yeah,
leagues, the scores are capped, like stats are kept. Like this stuff is important to these guys. Like, and I just like to keep bringing that up because that's something that
yeah.
I just don't see very much. Yeah. Sorry.
Mm,
So continue on.
no, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I watched that, as well, and it was so fascinating to see how, like you said, how important
Yeah.
sports are, and I think it also helps with, morale as
Yes.
well, bonding. So it all comes together. It's really, really great.
Yeah.
So yeah, in July 1944, the Essex Scottish land to assist with the D-Day landing on June 6th. But they kind of go in a little bit later. So that is Operation Atlantic, essentially. The objective of that was for the
Yeah.
Canadian forces to support the British forces in an armored assault on the western flank, to liberate a couple of towns south of the Orne River and then prepare to capture Various Ridge. So they enter battle July 20th during Operation Atlantic. The Essex Scottish are decimated again, 281
Mhm.
casualties. Because MacDonald is commanding, he is blamed by Brigadier Hugh Young for the failure, despite not exactly being responsible. So this notion of command responsibility is already a big part of the military. It's written in military handbooks. So there's a bunch of things that go wrong during that battle that I won't necessarily get too deep into. But MacDonald's blamed for this. This is detrimental to his identity. He is absolutely crushed. I mean, the way that he was described is absolutely damning to his personhood. Young apparently wrote, I have a quote here.
Mhm.
MacDonald seemed to have lost complete control and was himself in a very excited, nervous condition. His nervousness and seeming breakdown, his unsuitability for command, and the men's resulting lack of confidence in him um, were to blame essentially for the battle, based off of Young's explanation for what happened. So he's relieved of his position, which is awful. He's not having a great time in his life. He writes to superiors to reinstate his position. They're not too sure about that based off of what they heard.
Right.
And then by August 1944, he begins investigations into war crimes committed against Canadians as the Canadian representative with the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. I call it SHAEF. It's just easier. Like that's
Yeah.
a mouthful.
As everybody else, I don't like pronouncing it either. It's all safe.
SHAEF, absolutely. By February 1945, he serves as president of the court. March 1945, he personally interrogates Kurt Meyer. Meyer says he has no knowledge of any atrocities, any crimes that had been committed against Canadian prisoners of war. So that's the first time he speaks to Meyer. In April 1945, he goes to the court. He presents a report of acts of brutality committed by the 12th SS Division, but there's not enough hard evidence yet. So MacDonald keeps searching. This man is determined to serve justice for these murdered Canadian soldiers. And then in May 1945, the Canadian government establishes the 1st Canadian War Crimes Investigation Unit. That one also mouthful, but I don't exactly have an abbreviation that that works for that.
There isn't one.
MacDonald, yeah, sometimes you can't.
It's just not
So
possible.
no, MacDonald is appointed commanding officer of that, though. Go MacDonald. Um,
Mhm.
And then in June 1945, all of the records pertaining to the Meyer case are transferred over to them. SHAEF disbands in July 1945. At this point, Canada is making very little progress drafting war crimes regulations. Big problem for us because we chose to create our own investigation unit, which meant that we could not adhere to the Agreement of London that France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union decided to adhere to. And that means that we can't be at the Nuremberg trials in any legal capacity. I mean, MacDonald did go strictly as like a observer, yeah. But we couldn't do anything. Big problem, because what was the point of leading these investigations and everything else? And then it's so like MacDonald's sitting there and he's incredibly upset that essentially these crimes aren't getting solved. Like,
right.
Who is to blame for this? Like, this is a crime against Canadian soldiers and what's being done. So MacDonald, go getter. He drafts his own regulations, presents them to the government, and sure enough, they pass. So in August 1945, the Governor and Council passes the War Crimes Regulations. September of the same year, they're published. Command responsibility is huge in Canadian war crimes regulations. A rather new concept in Canadian law and in international law, really, and it is incredibly controversial, especially in the military spheres. In the regulations, quote, the commanding officer of any body of naval, military, or air forces having charge of an accused shall be deemed to be the commanding officer of the accused for the purposes of all matter preliminary and relating to trial and punishments. Insane. So October, MacDonald selected as lead prosecutor in the trial. Another win. This is just one step closer. At the same time, Japanese war crime trials begin in October and are kind of deemed of a greater importance, simply because a lot of war crimes that were being committed against Canadians and also Americans were being published at a much higher rate than what German war crimes against Canadians were really.
Right.
So that kind of took the main stage for a little bit there. October as well, MacDonald interrogates Meyer again. Meyer gives him a whole new story. MacDonald is not having it with this guy at all. And then in December 1945, on the 10th, the trial begins in Germany. Maybe we'll go into everything that happens, the background of why the trial happened and whatnot, but pretty much MacDonald rests his case upon the Hague Conventions, the Geneva Conventions, and he refers to the amendment number 12 of the Manual of Military Law. Pretty big stuff. So he really emphasizes Meyer's command responsibility in the trial. He opens the trial with, "It is the first occasion in the prosecution of war criminals, at least in Europe, in which an effort will be made to establish not only the immediate responsibility of a high-ranking officer for atrocities committed under his order, but also his vicarious responsibility for such crimes committed by troops under his command in the absence of a direct order." So we're coming out of the gates hot. Command responsibility is center focus. And so, sure enough, by December 28th, 1945, Meyer's found guilty of the first, fourth, and fifth charges and not guilty of the second and third, but he is sentenced to death by shooting, and his execution is scheduled for January 7th, 1946. After the trial, we think everything's good. Up to this point, it's like, yes, we have served justice. This is good as gold. MacDonald wants to ensure that the trial, everything has been done properly. All the paperwork's been filed. He's checking his boxes like any lawyer does, essentially. And this is Canada's first war crimes trial. MacDonald wants to ensure that things are done right. His boxes are checked. So he contacts the Canadian military headquarters to see if the review of the trial and sentence had been reviewed. It hadn't. And things go downhill from here. So Major General Chris Vokes kind of takes a look at things. And he issues an order delaying his Meyer's execution on January 5th, 2 days out. But like, he is pushing it. And at the same time, Meyer's counsel is urging him to make an appeal to his conviction. So a bunch of meetings happen, and things are pushed back. January 13th, 1946, Meyer was supposed to be executed by this point. He is not. His new sentence is approved. His sentence is commuted to life in prison. And this sparks insane controversy, as we know. What has happened here? And Vokes' commutation of the sentence undermines the findings of the trial and the foundation of the conviction, of the original conviction. MacDonald stands by this until the day he dies. Point blank period. He knows that the original sentencing was correct. He knows that the trial was conducted properly and fairly. And so, yeah. So Meyer's transferred to Dorchester Penitentiary in New Brunswick in April 1946. Yeah. So he's there. And MacDonald is sent to prosecute Brigadier Lister, who is accused of grift, which is a whole other can of worms. But MacDonald believes he's assigned that case as a form of punishment for speaking out against the commutation of Meyer's conviction. After that, he has had enough. He writes a letter to his wife, actually, at this point. He's like, I am getting out of here before the government has any more bright ideas with what to do with me. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Wow.
So July 1946, he returns home to Windsor. He's doing law again. July 1949, Meyer petitions for clemency. He's the only German war criminal not serving his sentence out in Germany at this point. MacDonald's living his best life, though, still. He becomes county solicitor. He becomes crown attorney and then clerk of peace in and for the county of Essex by April 1951. What's happening after World War II? The Cold War. So tensions are heightening. And so October 1951, Meyer's removed from Dorchester. He's flown to rural Germany, but his sentence is not pardoned. This is a way to kind of establish and maintain relationships, because the fear of communism is so insanely strong. So Canada's trying its best to, make some connections here and fight communism. Yeah, it will always go back to the Cold War. So December 1951, MacDonald issues a statement about the conviction release. MacDonald recognizes that the Canadian government would release Meyer due to growing international tensions with the Soviet Union. But he restates his belief that the trial was conducted fairly, and he stands by the original sentence. And the only way that it would ever be appropriate to consider releasing Meyer is if he were to serve in a NATO army to spare the lives of other young Canadians, which may be lost in another war. Cold War. What can we say? But still, he does not support anything less than the original conviction. Early 1952, German government issues a list of war criminals they want released. Of course, Meyer's name is on the list. And then a bunch of stuff happens where there's debates back and forth, there's meetings, lots of government officials, to put it shortly. And so September 7th, 1954, Meyer walks free from prison. Same month, MacDonald releases his own book about the trial. He essentially, verbatim, kind of wants to set the story straight, and he, again, stands by the original sentencing. He says, on the basis of justice, Meyer was never entitled to any reduction in the sentence originally imposed or is subsequently reduced. MacDonald is supported by the families and friends of the murdered Canadian prisoners of war. Arthur Orford, the father of Douglas Orford, who was a soldier who was murdered while in custody, personally thanked MacDonald for standing by the original conviction. MacDonald is kind of seen as this beacon of hope for justice.
Yep.
And after Meyer's release, though, MacDonald's life is quiet. He's, he's getting older. He works as the Crown Attorney for Essex County until 1961. He becomes the Judge of County and District Courts of Ontario. December 23rd, 1961, Meyer dies of a heart attack. So.
Oh no.
Yeah. So.
Oh, terrible.
Maybe that's the justice. MacDonald continues living a prosperous life until he dies at home at the age of 83 on June 2nd, 1986. And that is MacDonald's life. That's a little bit of the trial. It's a little bit of the upbraid.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, like you said, there's intersections of all kinds of things going on here. Yeah. So anyway, again, if you guys have questions who are watching now, feel free to throw them in here. One, I do want to kind of go back here real quick because I think I know the answer, but this one about, was there any Canadian observers at Tokyo or any of the other ones that were performed in, say, Burma, Malaysia? I think there were some in the Philippines too.
Personally, I'm not too sure. I did I did a little bit of research into the Tokyo trials solely because command responsibility was being brought up, but I focused more on that aspect rather than the Canadian observers. But if you know, then that would be great.
Yeah, if anybody knows, leave a comment either now or if you're watching later, please do. Because I'm not sure. I want to say maybe at Tokyo. I want to say yes, but I'm not entirely sure who.
Yeah.
It's a whole other... Yeah, sorry, just jump in here because I did my PhD on Hong Kong, right? And a little that comes up too, right? The whole poor treatment of the POWs and then the trial of the Japanese Canadian who's in, the Imperial Japanese Army and literally murders Canadians. His is, okay, yeah, there was a Canadian judge at Tokyo.
Awesome.
Yeah. So that's good to anyway, the point I was making, yeah, there was the Japanese Canadian Keno Inouye, who was known as the Kamloops Kid, just how that whole thing went and that whole other. I mean, someone else could do what you did for that because it's a whole other crazy story. Anyway, but just there wasn't as much as some of us would have liked to see in the East. But we're focusing on the West here, Kurt Meyer and MacDonald. So one of the first questions I wanted to ask is because I read the first part of your work there, the sources is there this come up in a lot of his letters, like when this is going on? Does he have any doubts or concerns during the trial that this isn't going to go through? Like, is there any insights like that you were able to see?
Yeah, he absolutely was. He was lobbying the Canadian government for drafting these regulations. He is pushing to go to trial. He is pushing, even when he's with SHAEF, to continue these investigations. I don't have enough evidence yet. I need more evidence. There's two medical officers that Meyer tells him about in one of the first interviews, that he said, I know nothing, but these medical officers told me about they found the bodies, and they told me about it, and I instructed the men to then bury them, kind of thing. And then the man that committed the crimes actually died in a subsequent battle. And so MacDonald was like, I need names of these men. Where are these men? He could not find these men before the trial. He does, however,
Right.
find these men after the trial. And the testimony, I mean, it's not entered into any sort of court
No.
documents, obviously, 'cause it's after the trial. But yeah, MacDonald is writing to his wife, to his friends at the Canadian military headquarters, to the government, and he is pushing for it. And you could really tell, I could really tell when going through these sources that he was quite on edge about the trial not happening, about Canada not having any sort of stance really in Canadian or in international politics and in international law. Like, what are we doing? We're not at Nuremberg. Like, we need something going on. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Continue on. Or is there anything else you wanted to add to that, or because the questions are starting to come in? So
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's it. MacDonald was, yeah, quite nervous about it not happening, and I think he represented a lot of Canadians as well who were worried that it wasn't going to happen and that justice wasn't going to get served for their fellow countrymen. So, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so great. So there's a question here. It's good. It's a fair question because from Robert, a couple words. So what was the? Again, I don't know. No offense to Robert, just the problem. I don't know if that's even the right word. Like, what can you? Because I guess this is one of the things I did want to talk about here is the whole evoked thing, and not necessarily in the literature because it's laid out, but on the internet and popularly, it is just seemingly the facts don't matter. Like, can you lay out what happened, why evokes, not necessarily the thinking behind what he did, but what led to those series of events in a little more detail of why these things?
Yeah. So, like I said, MacDonald goes to see if the review of the trial and the sentence had been conducted. It hadn't. That kind of sparks. That I think that's like the match that kind of ignited everything from there on. And so at that time too, I mean, immediately right after the trial, Meyer's legal counsel is urging him to appeal his conviction. There's a little bit of back and forth over who is in charge of conducting this review. They land on Vokes because he was in command at the time. So
Yes, he was.
they choose him. He 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 does some things as well during war that maybe weren't the best decision, but whom
Right.
that's a whole other can of worms. Essentially, he
I know. It's yeah. Sorry.
no, yeah,
Because
it's a
okay,
whole
well,
other can
sorry,
of worms
not to
because he
cut you off,
essentially
but
he is pretty heated at one point during battle, and he essentially says that he wants to execute these German prisoners of war, but someone else steps in and says, "Hey there, absolutely not. We cannot do that." And so that essentially saves his ass, for lack of a better term.
more or less,
Um, so I think
yeah, pretty
maybe
much.
he, in the back of his head, he's thinking about his uh, actions or lack thereof in the past, or what could have happened, and he could have had things been different, been sitting in a similar seat actually. So he meets with a bunch of important people: High Commissioner Vincent Massey, CMHQ Chief of Staff, other important military officials, and he disregards Jan Jesenic's testimony, who is a soldier with the SS, but he, I believe he was Polish, and he was kind of, he was forced into becoming a soldier with the German forces. And during his testimony, he says, absolutely, like Meyer said, we don't have space for these prisoners. They're eating our rations. We're not taking prisoners. And so Vokes disregards that testimony and says, nowhere could I find that order to shoot prisoners to be proved. And he also raised the concern about British relations with Germany in the future if Meyer had to serve the original sentence. So that's essentially what happens with Vokes. And the sentence is obviously commuted to life in prison, and then later on dismissed.
Yeah, so I mean, how do I say this? Well, I've said this before. I'll say it again. Vokes is out of his depth, pretty much beyond. I don't know. Battalion command even seems a little too much for him. I just don't think he was the right man for any of this.
Yeah.
And then he does things like that. It just really cements that sort of. He shouldn't have been there.
Yeah,
that's
he
just my
also
opinion.
had a very strong distaste for MacDonald and for men that he accused MacDonald of never seeing battle, essentially, in one statement, which is quite insane because that's not at all true. He very strong distaste for MacDonald and for men that he just didn't think were fit soldiers, essentially, in his eyes. So yeah, he's quite the character, to say the least.
I mean, yeah, most people just remember the mustache, but not all the other not good things. And this part of the story, right? That's an element. I mean, it's just, again, I'm just not a fan of his, and historically speaking, and just things. He shouldn't have been in those positions. But the whole, like the thing you mentioned, right, like stopping from the shooting of the prisoners, right, the distracting of the town in Germany that they flattened, basically, out of Russian, literally, is in the orders. I mean, be that what as it may. But the whole idea, maybe this can be just your opinion, but because I know the focus isn't on Vokes, but like you say, there could have been Vokes on trial here. Does that come into his thinking, or is that us just applying these thoughts? Did you come across anything where he says this or writes this or alludes to this? I just don't know of anything that actually says that proves any of that. To me, it's just all conjecture.
Yeah, I did a little bit
there for a second. Sorry.
Oh.
So sorry. Okay, well, I'll just say it again because I think my internet may have skipped out for a second there.
No. I heard. I was just waiting to be
okay.
Caught up. Yeah.
Does Vokes actually say any of this? Does he actually say, "I'm worried about being put on trial"?
No. From what I remember, because keep in mind too, this was quite a few years ago that I wrote all of this. No, but he has his own book, actually, and he doesn't say it, but he does say that he kind of implies that command responsibility isn't. It's not
yes, it is.
a thing. Essentially, it's not a real concept, and it's useless. Kind of. Very, very interesting. He also, keep in mind, he has no law background. He is a military man, which I'm not going to discredit those experiences. I'm sure I don't know a lot about him other than in the context of the trial. But I'm sure his experiences as a military man are important, don't get me wrong. However, I think that he wasn't exactly um, knowledgeable enough in law and politics as well to be making some of the decisions that he made.
Right. Uh, yeah, he was not a pleasure. I'll fly just myself. He didn't understand these things. But this and Sheldrake raises a really interesting point here is that those that permanent force non-permanent militia come back to me. It's great. You got to separate these out. I think that and back a little bit more. Where to go? Here it is. From Sheldrake again, a question about his zeal. I mean, I think that's a fair assumption. And this is what you talk about, right?
Sorry, you're frozen for me on my side.
The command, the gender theory, all of that. Kind of what
you're still frozen for me.
Behind that is you hear me? Let me back. Still nothing? Okay.
Oh, okay. It's clear. It's just the oh, we're getting there. Picture's coming back.
Just coming back. Okay, yeah. My internet is still not great.
Okay, so yeah, to answer the question that was just posed before getting a little bit frozen, yes, absolutely. MacDonald's zeal essentially in pursuing the trial for Meyer can absolutely be linked back to being relieved of command after Operation Atlantic. I, from my research, I think the way that he saw it, I obviously can't speak on his behalf, but I did enough research. Welcome back.
Am I back? Where
Yes.
am I? Can you see me? Am I okay?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry, continue on. Ignore me.
Okay. So yeah, he is after Operation Atlantic, he is assumed responsible. He wasn't apparently being a good commander, and so he's upset at the fact that he's lost his command. It's also incredibly shameful. It's going back to Canada after being relieved of command of a regiment is just not a position that you want to be in, especially during World War II. And when this is kind of where the gender thing kind of comes into play, masculinity in specific, the epitome of masculinity was at this point being a soldier, being a citizen soldier. That kind of man next door meets, experienced soldier coming into one. And so MacDonald essentially being told and having been written about that he wasn't a soldier is essentially saying that he also isn't a good man.
Right.
And so he's incredibly upset. I mean, does becoming part of SHAEF and then the Canadian War Crimes Investigation Unit help? Absolutely, but I think he was being a lawyer too as well before the war. I think he had a very strong moral compass. He had a very strong sense of what was just and what wasn't, and he not only wanted to do this for himself, he wanted to do this for his men. Keep in mind, his men were being absolutely obliterated in battle multiple times before. I mean, not including all the other casualties and other battles that they experienced. But him really seeing these men as his boys, and I think that kind of translated over to the murdered Canadian prisoners of war as well. And it just so happened that he was the man that wanted to serve justice, and his ideas essentially aligned with Canadian ideas and what Canadians wanted. So yeah, I think I think he sat back and was like, well, if I can be blamed for what happened after Operation, or what happened during Operation Atlantic, and it wasn't even a fault of mine, then Meyer absolutely can be blamed for not being able to control his men when he very much could have.
Right.
So yeah, I definitely think that fueled his fire to get the justice that he and other soldiers and other Canadians wanted.
Right. Yeah. So, sorry about the internet troubles. I don't know. Maybe we're still impacted from the storm and things like that, because I'm in a neighborhood that was hit pretty bad. So I don't know if it has any kind of impacts, but anyway, sorry about that, everybody. So our next question, this is kind of on that same vein about the whole seeking justice and everything like that. And it's from our guest for tomorrow, from Kevin. Does MacDonald's departure from the investigation unit, because of the reasons, does that have potential, impact on stuff that happens afterwards, or the lack thereof of things happening afterwards?
I mean, yes. I would say that the frustration with the commutation definitely kind of plays into later trials, and just especially with this being the first, right? Like, it was such a significant moment for Canada, for MacDonald, obviously, and kind of having that decision be overturned kind of underestimates and undermines all of the work that was put into it. I'm not 100% versed in the trials afterwards. Obviously, I know that Canada conducted a few more of its own trials afterwards, but because I took on this absolute monster, with figuring out MacDonalds Life and then adding everything into it, I didn't get too far into later Canadian trials, but yeah, I can only assume. I know that command responsibility is still, a term that we use, I would say. Principle. Perfect. Even so far as in civilian life as well, with police, for example. Even, I mean, we see it kind of on a lesser scale. It's not as important, but like at work, right? If you're a manager of a team and something goes wrong, and your superiors, obviously, they're going to look at you and go, well, you're leading this team. What is going on here? So, yeah, we kind of continue to see it throughout.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to put it.
Mhm.
Now, there's been an interesting conversation going on in the sidebar here about, and again, if you don't have an answer, that's perfectly fine, because again, the timeline doesn't match up. But as I know how the Canadian Army works at this point and prior to the war, just because you're not in command anymore doesn't mean you don't have a say of what's going on.
Mhm.
Curry in the interwar period, people are constantly writing to him, being like, "I want this done. What do I do? Or can you help me?" So on that same vein, we just had someone ask about Kriar, right? Kriar is not in charge anymore at this point. I know that.
Mhm.
Does MacDonald go to Kriar? Does he write Kriar? Be like, help me out? Like, is there anything you can do? Does that come up at all?
Um, I don't believe so.
Okay.
But I know that he does write to oh goodness, who is it? He writes to a couple
Simmons,
superiors. He writes to Major General Charles Folks,
Folks, and Simmons, maybe.
Simmons as well. Yes, Folks decides to kind of let things stand as it is, and then he then goes to make an appeal to Simmons. But then by that point, it had been decided that he was going to investigate war crimes.
Right.
So I still think that was something that
Okay.
stung a little bit. But I mean, I don't know if he. I mean, I can't remember either. It's been so long.
Yeah.
If he wrote, I mean, he might have, but who knows really? I mean, the Windsor Archives have quite a lot of material, so if anyone's interested.
Yeah. It would take some more digging, and that's fine. So it seems like it was more, I guess, to the front end of these things, where
Mhm,
he's trying to be like, we need to do this. Why
mhm.
aren't we doing this? Instead opposed to after the fact, right? Is
Yeah.
that kind of your sense of these things? Like he was really focused on getting this done,
Mhm.
and then everything comes off the rails afterwards, so to speak. About
Oh, yeah.
Is that kind of your sense of this?
Yeah, I would
Okay.
say so. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's because, yeah, like you said, it's not as easy. It's not an easy answer. It's not an easy story, right?
Mhm.
Especially because you focused on McDonald. Like you said, there's so many moving parts.
Oh,
All
absolutely.
of the major Canadian commanders are involved, all
Mhm.
of them at the time, right? Except for Kriar, because he's the war ends, he's basically done, right? Yes, he's still there. I know that, but he's basically done.
Mhm.
It's everybody else. It's Simmons. It's Folks back home. It's
Yeah.
Vokes, who's in charge in Europe because Simmons
Mhm.
is then gone into
Yeah.
Britain at the IDC, the Defense College. All of that. So it's just you have a lot of big egos and a lot of big personalities involved. So I get it. It's not easy to keep all these strands together because I know people are constantly writing to each other in these time periods.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that anything is done from it either, right? Just because they try doesn't mean it leads to anything. That's just kind of my sense. I don't know if
Mhm.
you share that as well, but that's kind of what I got from it.
Yeah, and I think that there's so many um, moving parts as well with like I'm writing about someone's life, but at the same time, like
Right.
there's all these other lives that are involved in his and that correlate even if they're not directly involved. And there's so many events going on that McDonald is just one single thread in this entire sweater, so to say. Like
Yeah.
yeah,
This
there's a
web.
lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just reading some comments because Simmons is coming up quite a bit. I mean, that's what's so interesting to me is Simmons is here. He again, this isn't a secret. I'm not a big fan of his either, especially because how he good commander, whatever. That's not what I mean. It's in terms of after the fact. If something goes bad, he's quick to be like, "This is your fault, not my fault. You didn't listen, or you didn't
Yeah.
understand me. This is you did this." It's because this is Atlantic too, right? It's Atlantic. He's in both. I mean, he's just an interesting figure, right? Because he just especially Simmons, everyone knows with the Black Watch, right? Simmons just is like, yeah, you guys screwed up. He blames the dead guys, which is easy because they can't fight back.
Mhm.
But like that's another thing why I think it's so interesting with MacDonald because, and again, this is not it's just what it is. I think the Black Watch overshadows everything else with Atlantic, because again, you said it, the Essex Scottish are just hit just as badly. They just don't get that attention that other units do. So that I think that gets forgotten in this whole story, and why your work is important, because MacDonald is connected to all of this, and it's informs all of this. But he's, like you said in your work, he's not even mentioned in even the historiography either.
Yeah, very much so in passing. Patrick Broad obviously mentions him a little bit. Ian Campbell, oh goodness, Margolian, Howard Margolian also. And then, I mean, he has his own work, but that's not, one, it's incredibly hard to get. I have to put out there. Finding MacDonald's book, ridiculously hard. So it's not one that you just go to chapters and pick up, so to say. There's a couple other ones that kind of go into a little bit of detail about MacDonald. I have all my sources here. That's why I'm looking down at them. There's Tony Foster, Meeting of Generals. That was the one source, actually, that I found that had the most mentioned about MacDonald, which was insane. Yeah, I was quite shocked that he was mentioned so often in that one. And still, keep in mind, it wasn't a lot, but it was more than
that
some.
book is problematic at best. I still have people who bring that up all the time. I'm like, look at this, and I'm like, you don't know the context behind that book. It's often, the son writes about the father, and it's glowing reviews, and he was the greatest man on the planet, and that is not what happened with that one. But I'll just leave it at that. But that's just that's weird. Anyway, like, he's not mentioned in it. It doesn't come up. Why do you think that is? Why do you think MacDonald is just basically written out, even from the Canadians? Because, like you just said, Canadian historians do this too. Why?
I just think personally that when we think about post-war and we think about the trials, I don't think a single person that I know of in my circle at least would sit there and say, "Oh yeah, obviously the trial of Kurt Meyer happened." They go immediately to Nuremberg, and I think that it's kind of, and like the historiography, like immediately afterwards of like the trial and the war, even it very much this kind of lingering Dominion mindset where we're very much connected to Great Britain, so to say. So I think that it's kind of just overshadowed. And I also think too that with human curiosity, like we're very curious creatures, and I mean we've seen the rise of true crime podcast television shows, TikToks even at this point. We're more interested in the crimes and why the crimes happen, more so than what happens after the crimes. And that's not necessarily a fault of ours. We're just curious people. We don't necessarily, I mean, unless you're in law and policing, like we're not dealing with insane, brutal crimes on the regular. So as viewers and as the audience, we're more so interested in that side, and like, how could someone do that? Why would someone do that? More so than the who picked up the pieces afterwards and who tried to make things right, because that's not as exciting, so to say. But I mean, MacDonald is an incredibly important person in this narrative, and I'd argue that if it wasn't for him, I don't think Canadian war crimes trials would have even potentially happened. Because there wasn't a lot being done. There wasn't a lot of pushing and productivity from the government to make it happen. So I really think that he played an incredibly important role to make those happen. And it's just sad that it's not mentioned as much.
So I think that's really interesting points. I think it might be more to do with more human nature than anything to do with
Mhm.
I don't know, Canadians. But you mentioned like the whole Dominion status, which I think I agree with you on that. I think that's part of why this doesn't get pushed much. I mean, I think all roads lead back to Mackenzie King, especially on these bigger issues, because he just doesn't want to deal with any of this stuff. I mean, he doesn't want to deal with anything if he doesn't have to, but like he doesn't, like none of the higher ups in the government are pushing for any of this, right?
Yeah.
It's all lower levels, like MacDonald or the people pushing for this. King's like, I'm worried about the next election. I don't care about any of this. So I think that's part of it. But I think you raised a really interesting point about the whole, and maybe this, again, not what you focused on, but this whole bigger issue, right? The looming thing over all of this, obviously, is the horrible crimes committed by the 12th SS in Normandy, and not just at the Abbaye, across their whole, front. It happens constantly.
Yeah.
I mean, and another thing, sorry, I was going to bring this up earlier, but then the internet got all wonky on me, is there was lots of evidence at the time, even in the fighting, and it's being noted, right? They're finding bodies, their hands bound and bullets in the backs of their heads. And nobody does anything about it. It's and there's been lots of theories, and maybe if you come across this at all a little bit, because we have some good questions, I want to get to them, because this is we're starting to actually pick up with the viewership and more people, which is great. It's just we're an hour in, but we're still getting more questions, which is always awesome. But it seems that kind of other things. Did this again come up at all? Because like the Battle of the Bulge has the same sort of thing, right? There's numerous executions of POWs. Do you think that I don't want to this in a mean way, but the American stories kind of overtake what happens in Normandy? Does things like, if they even came across like things like Malmedy taking attention at SHAEF, does that play into this at all?
I think so. I didn't really honestly investigate too heavily into crimes that were committed against Americans. Obviously, war crimes were being committed by everyone. Let's just throw that out there. I'm not going to gloss over that fact. But pertaining to Meyer and the SS specifically, this wasn't Meyer's first crime. Really, he had already been accused of murdering civilians. This wasn't his first. So, and I mean, even the 12th SS division just had an absolutely horrendous record of crimes and fanaticism. And I mean, even Meyer was a diehard Nazi.
He died a diehard Nazi. To the grave.
Yeah. And I mean, same with the men that he was commanding. These were young men, like in the 12th SS division. Some of them were like 18, 19 years old, like incredibly young. And like, these are like the first generation of soldiers for Germany who had essentially grown up being indoctrinated with these Nazi ideologies. And so when you have Nazi fanatics being led by another Nazi fanatic, it's a recipe for disaster. And that's exactly what happened. They all fuel each other, and crimes were being committed left, right, and center. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very good point. And I don't know, again, you probably didn't come up with this because it's just not part of, well, maybe it was actually, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. But the other commander in all of this, who's never mentioned, hardly ever, Mulcahy, he is, again, arguably, as Sheldrake says, and Sheldrake knows his stuff. Everyone knows who he is. It's Dave. Everyone knows Dave Patterson knows his stuff. He is arguably worse. I mean, this is like a race to the bottom here. And he gets off completely. They just give up on trying to, convict him in any way, shape, or form. They say there's no evidence. There's evidence literally all over the place. Like, they just don't seem to want to find it. And that's just kind of what I was thinking before about the earlier questions, is because that comes to mind, because I literally just finished a piece on all of this, all the Normandy massacres for the JBC. That'll be coming out, I assume, shortly. And he is so much worse. Like, he goes out of his way to literally kill Canadians. Like, he literally drives from his command, like his HQ, behind the lines, to a smaller HQ and tells them, stop sending back POWs, and has them executed right then and there. Like, this guy is so much more worse in this way. And and there's evidence of this that was recorded, and it goes nowhere. I know, again, this is your focus is MacDonald, and he's involved in Meyer, but does any of these other German war criminals come up at all? Does he talk about any of these and in connection?
Yeah, like come up? There's a lot of pressure, actually. I don't know too much about these other German war criminals. Obviously, like you said, I did very much focus on MacDonald and his role in the trial. I mean, also, it was an MRP, right? I only
you can only do so much in 100 pages.
I can only do so much, and even then, they were telling me, you got to cut this down, you got to make this shorter. So
they tell that to everybody, by the way.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I could have gone on for days and days and days.
Oh yeah, we all could.
But yeah, there was a lot of pressure to wrap up investigations, actually, with SHAEF, with the Canadian War Crimes Investigation Unit. And I know that MacDonald was fighting for that not to happen. And he was like, I'm not done yet. Like, there's so many other things that we have to do. There's so much more evidence we have to, find and present, because it's not okay that people are getting away with these things.
Right.
But the Canadian War Crimes Investigation Unit is disbanded in May 1946. It's so short, like it's such a short-lived time, and there's only so much people can do, and especially someone as determined as MacDonald. Like, there's only so much he can take on, and I know that his focus primarily was command responsibility in the Meyer trial, because it was the first one out of the gate.
Right.
But yeah, I definitely think that pressure played a big part in the disbanding of SHAEF and the Canadian War Crimes Investigation Unit. So I think that after that, and then I think even potentially with the changing of Meyer's sentencing, I think might have also played a role in not having the pressure to find other war criminals and convict them as well.
Right, which, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, in that way, I mean, it doesn't make sense to leave this and not, seek justice for those who are murdered. But I mean, it's yeah. Like you already said, or was already been said, Cold War. I mean, technically, Grzinko is to blame, if you want to put it that way. I guess technically, which is funny because I lived right where all this happened. Anyway, I think you're right, but I think the Cold War here is the overriding thing. It was a mistake, in my opinion, to focus on this and to think in some way, shape, or form that all these 12th SS murderers could somehow help NATO against the Soviet Union. To me, is just bonkers.
Yeah, I mean, at one point in his time in Canada, Meyer was actually assisting the Canadian government with military tactics with Canadians. They slapped him in a Canadian uniform, and he was out there with Canadian troops, which is just absolutely insane. And like I said, like MacDonald even said, Meyer's release was purely political. It was not on the basis of any legal grounds. So it was just to make nice with Germany for the sake of protecting ourselves against communism. So
and trying to bring, what is colloquially known as West Germany into the fold and all of that. And I mean, I've said this before on so many different platforms about why you're going to the losers for advice on how to win when the tactical, incompetence of the 12th SS was quite clear, yes, let's daylight attack fixed positions. That'll be fine. And then they get wiped out. Yeah, let's go to the guy that ordered these things, right? That's a good plan. Even if you set the whole morality thing aside, which you never should do with these guys, but it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? In that sense, I'm just like, it always just boggles my mind. And that's things people, I don't think, especially now, know, right? That Meyer was used like that in Canada. Like, that's just crazy to me. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, the Cold War politics was messy, to say the least. Like immediately after the war was over, there was a race from Canada, Britain, US, who's getting these scientists and other, important Nazis to work on our projects. Like, who's getting them first? Like, they can't fall into the wrong hands. Oh, if Soviet convinces these people to work for them, like, who knows what could happen. So it's really interesting to see how quickly things fell apart, and how it was just a race essentially between all of us as to who could use these people for our advantage, even though they shouldn't have. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, they should not have in any way, shape, or form done that. But okay, well, that's the other thing. There's a question I missed, and I think it's an interesting one because, again, I keep saying it, but MacDonald's the focus. Other figures that were involved in this, like, best question here. Did that happen at all, or what's any connection or anything like that here, or anything? Did you see anything?
I want to say Campbell definitely was interviewed. I know in a few papers, like the statement that MacDonald made, actually, one of them about the commutation of Meyer's sentencing, Campbell makes the same statement. Campbell and MacDonald continue correspondence afterwards. Both stand by the original sentencing and how the trial was conducted. Other than that, I'm not 100% sure if he has been interviewed, or was interviewed, I should say, in any greater depth. I know that MacDonald was, I think, by Patrick Broad for the Osgood Law Society.
Okay, right.
Yeah, a nice big long interview there, so that was good. But yeah, Clarence Campbell, not 100% sure.
Okay.
But I mean, if anyone wants to write up a little something about his life, and it would be a good
companion piece.
Yeah.
100%. I mean, I think that's part of it. I mean, it's just, again, like, we know so little about all these. I mean, other than the diehards, right? Like people watching right now and others. These tiny pieces, again, on these bigger scales, right? It's hard to keep all this together and keep it all clear because, again, like we said, it's so complicated, it's so confusing. Actually, at least another question here. Sorry, this is what I told you about before we got on the air, about how I laugh at things I read. He was too busy thinking about hockey. And it also, yes, it always comes back to hockey in some way, shape, or form. I wish it wasn't true, but it just really it's sad but true. But it confuses the Brits, and the Americans still don't get the obsession that we have. But anyway, this is another good question, going back to some more towards the beginning and more towards the war. And I know a little bit about this, but I'm interested in kind of your thoughts. Is information flow on the ground, right? You're advancing, you're trying to break out of a bridgehead and then advance and get them out of France, right? Did you come across anything of what's being discussed at the time once these crimes are discovered, even in the moment? Is there anything being done, or is this all just left as the armies advance and other concerns take priority?
Oh, that's a great question. Honestly, I'm not 100% sure. I do know, however, that once rumors started spreading that Germans were murdering Canadians, that it kind of lit a little bit of a spark as to what was going on. However, I'm not 100% sure if things were being dealt with 100% like during battles. I don't, if I'm being honest with you, I don't necessarily think that it was number one priority. I do know that in the Ardennes Abbey massacres, for example, like bodies weren't discovered until
Yeah.
a little bit later, and even at some points, bodies had to be re-examined, so they had to be,
Yeah.
you know, re
Moved.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Be exhumed. Yeah.
That's the word, exhumed. Yeah. So I don't think during battle was necessarily the top priority. I mean, I get it, but definitely afterwards, it was something that Canadian government, British government, American government, military, they were definitely looking into that and seeing what was going on, because rumors are spreading and things are getting back home as well, and that's causing
Right.
a lot of uproar with people's families. And then, I mean, you obviously have the families of these victims who are like, missing in action isn't really a answer.
No, it's not.
Right? So finding out what truly happened is definitely big importance as the war is coming to an end and after the war.
Yeah, and I think that's great. That leads to another question I had, is with that, with everything MacDonald did, because you got to take a look at his papers and everything like that. Was he in communication? Well, I got two questions that I just thought about the second one. Was he in communication with families at all? I know that's kind of not okay in the legal world, but maybe after, did he speak to anybody? Were people writing to him about any of this? Was there any connections to the families of the murdered or anything like that?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. During the trial, I don't think so. He definitely was the kind of man who was making sure things were done correctly and legally. But afterwards, like I said, in the one example, one of the fathers of the victims had reached out to him and said, thank you for the work that you did. Thank you for continuing to stand up. Even as MacDonald was getting older, he would make speeches for different groups of people, veterans and other groups. And even then, I'm sure that there had to be some level of contact between him and families and people that were affected by the crimes that were committed.
Okay, cool. And then the second question, because again, I just finished that article, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, and the stuff's still fresh in my mind of everything that happened. Because again, it's more than just the Abbé d'Ardennes. It's also just seemingly random executions on the battlefield, even well after being taken prisoner, right? Because there's that whole debate that is connected to this of in the heat of the moment and what's a surrender, what's a fake surrender, and all that in the heat of the battle, right? Then, when they say cold-blooded murder, there's hot-blooded murder. This is all cold-blooded murder. Did Campbell or anyone that he worked with or any of this get out there and talk to civilians that saw any of this stuff happened? Is there any sort of, because you mentioned he interviewed he interrogated Meyer twice or at least twice. Was he talking to anybody else? German soldiers, German POWs, French civilians, anybody? Did he do this personally? Did he have other people doing this?
Yeah, the team with the Canadian War Crimes Investigation Unit, they had translators, they had other investigators working under MacDonald. MacDonald was touring prisoner of war camps, trying to find people. He is following up on every lead possible. Obviously, civilians at the Abbé, like, they were interviewed. They were part of the trial. Their testimonies were part of the trial. He was doing everything in his power to get cold hard evidence. So yes, civilians, because some of these civilians were the ones finding the bodies as well. So their testimony is incredibly important. And I mean, after the war is done too, just the sheer number of men that were moving around, trying to go home, stuck as prisoners of war. Like that's a whole other can of worms, and going through all of these camps and trying to find certain people who another person said had seen something or heard something. Like it was quite the mission, to say the least. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and like, well, because sorry, I just asked that because you meant I forget his name. I always forget his name. And my wife's of Polish ancestry, so I should get better with Polish names. But because that testimony was the one of the parts of this, right? One of the, I mean, if I'm wrong, please correct me. But it seemed like one of the bedrocks of, particularly at the Abbey and the original, like the first killings there, the 20, the first 2 days, like that seemed like the bedrock of this, and then it's just thrown out, right, seemingly by folks, and it's been questioned ever since, right? We were talking about unsavory characters related to certain beliefs nowadays. I don't want to say any words that might get the stream, dinged for something later, but and right, that is why I asked about the civilians, right? Because this is that testimony is just seemingly tossed out. Whereas there's all these people that are saying this thing's happened, right? There's evidence of these things. There's forensic evidence of these things. And yet there's still concern around this, of that it wasn't done properly, or he wasn't given a fair trial, and all of this stuff. It just, it drives me a little crazy. I'm sure it does for you too. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I absolutely agree. The person you're thinking of is Jan Jesenik.
Yeah, that's it.
I think I'm saying that right too. I'm not Polish.
If you have a bad pronunciation, anybody knows, that would be great. Yes.
Fingers crossed that I'm getting that right. There was a little bit of concern with his testimony simply because he was forced to fight.
Yeah.
And so I from my understanding, there was a little bit of hesitation with how true essentially his testimony could be, because of the hatred that he felt towards the German. But I mean, I read the entire trial, the documentary record. It's 700 something pages. Yeah, intense. Took up way too much space on my computer.
Oh, I bet it did.
And so, yeah, I mean, based off of what I've read, I have no doubt, based on his testimony of other civilians, the medical officers that MacDonald finds after the trial, and their statements about what happened, Meyer's own wishy-washiness with his story, recanting his story and changing his story constantly. There's no doubt in my mind that it didn't happen how the original trial proved. So there were a lot of people who testified, and a lot of testimonies from people who died. Actually, that was a big part of the trial as well, that there could be evidence entered from people who died, and that could be used in the trial, which is very interesting. Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and that's getting bigger, this part of the MacDonald story. It's again, I just see it all the time because I've done video like what we were discussing at the Kurt Meyer, which is linked below if anyone hasn't seen it. I'm sure most of you have, who follow the channel regularly, about his trial, because there's a newsreel, right, and they talk about he's sentenced to death.
Yeah.
And then the newsreel, because it's over, it's done in late 45, and it doesn't have a conclusion to the story. And I added my commentary and context, which I think is really interesting, because this source is like, yeah, it's all going to be fine. Like you were discussing at the beginning, it's all going to be worked out. Justice will be done. And then it all goes to a mess, and it all changes. I think it's just an interesting part of all this. I mean, it's obviously not going to turn satisfactory, because he died in the 60s, whereas the others didn't get a chance to live because they were executed for no reason. And all of that later on. Now, kind of like a wrap-up question, because I think we're getting over the time here. But someone who worked on MacDonald literally did, as you said in your work, a biography of him in that sense, and put into this context, right, wrapping around it and examining this whole trial that way.
Mhm.
What would you like if you had the perfect, historical magic wand and be like, I can change this? Like, what would you have MacDonald's story told more? How would you want it connected to how the whole Meyer story's told? Like if you could do that, what would you like to see?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, definitely, he needs to be written about more in connection with the trial and telling the story of the victims because, like I said, it's so important that um, with collective memory we stop connecting victims to the perpetrators of the
Mm,
crimes. Like it's, um, I think that oftentimes the perpetrator and the crimes that were committed can overshadow the stories of the victims. I mean, there are um, quite detailed records of each of the victims in other work, but I think adding MacDonald's story and all the things that MacDonald did to really push for this to happen is so important in the context of post World War II, um, war crimes trials. I think it's important for Canadian history, World War II history. Yeah, I would definitely wave my magic wand and sprinkle him in a little bit more, I should say,
yeah.
because what he did was incredibly important, like I said, and I don't think that we would have even had the trials had he not fought for it. So yeah.
Which I agree. I mean, I think I was saying this earlier, but I get the sense of it's just, and connected kind of to Scott's question. He's talking about it in the war, but I mean, even after they're like, it's over, the war's over, whatever, let's get on with this. Who cares? I
Mhm,
kind of get that sense from the Canadian government about, well, not even just this. I mean, I get that from treatment of ex-POWs to pensions. I mean, yes, don't, before people come at me, I know about everything with Veterans Affairs. I know, I don't need to be told about that. I get it. And it was a good package, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, I've seen the paperwork. I've seen the letters to each other. It's just half the time they're like, I'm tired of talking about this. Can I just go back to being a soldier again? Like,
mhm,
I see that so much. So I get the sense of that's what's going on here too. So it drives me a little crazy that these things were just seen as kind of an inconvenience more than anything.
mhm.
It's just kind of a frustrating thing, but again, it's after the fact. So what can you do, right? Um,
Yeah.
it is what it is. But I had another question for you. Now I lost it. Distracted my own self from my own question.
There's so many questions,
I
so
know I have so many. I could go on and on about this forever. It's just it's just such an interesting story. That's like you said, not as well known. It
mhm.
should be better told and how this is done and everything like that. So, um, yeah. So I don't know unless I don't think I missed any questions. If anybody has any questions, we can do it while we got it now. Still got a few more minutes, if that's okay, Taylor. If you don't have to run,
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Maybe the question will come back to me because I thought it was a pretty good one, and now it's gone. I hate when that happens. It drives me crazy. Oh, I remember what it was. How do I say this? I can bring this back to the way you did it, right? You had to bring that originality to your work,
Mhm,
and you came across this and you used gender theory on this.
mhm.
Do you think that's part of the reason why MacDonald's written out? He didn't live up to this traditional masculinity. He failed. Sorry, I never do this right. Failed on the battlefield.
Yeah.
He's best left out. Do you get a sense that's why? Is that a little bit of this? Yeah.
Potentially, yeah, because like I said, right, like, his failure as commander is failure as a man, but then also, I mean, because he was such a determined individual with, you know, getting this to trial, serving justice, like, he was lobbying everyone to make things work. He was so determined,
Mm,
and I think too that maybe some of his determination, may have rubbed some people the wrong way, and,
okay.
so him being kind of written out like that as well, and then I mean, I feel too oftentimes with, I mean, based on my own experiences, the way that, like, history, is sometimes taught, we're not really discussing each individual player in an event, even the ones that are important, we're just talking about the event in general, and, like,
Mm,
with the trial, it's very much Canada's first war crimes trial, and this is who we take to trial, and this is what happened. This is the sentencing um, of the trial, and this is what happens afterwards. We're not focusing on each individual player, but yeah, and then as well, like I said, folks definitely um, didn't like MacDonald too much either, right? And he was a bigger figure in the Canadian military than MacDonald was.
Oh yeah.
And so, I mean, I don't know for certain, but maybe the way that folks felt about MacDonald, other people also felt.
Right.
I think that could be another potential.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be right because like as Sheldrake mentioned earlier, is the whole permanent force versus the active militia, the non-permanent active
Mhm.
militia. God, I hate that they called it that. Such a mouthful. They finally changed it. God, it drives me crazy. Anyway, like that whole the conflict between two of those, and
Mhm.
how the Canadian command structure worked in that way, and how these two worlds mesh together in a war, and then how that kind of falls apart afterwards. And I think you might be right because, and like I said, and earlier in the promotion of this, I think your angle is a needed angle in terms of how we understand not just an individual, but
Mhm.
what these background things matter, right? This isn't
Yeah.
just talking about it to talk about it because you're trying to fill a paper or something. That's not what's going on here. There's
Mhm.
elements here that nobody has never looked at before, and we're
Yeah.
missing a piece of the puzzle. So I think your work's really good in that aspect, and I think that's what we need more of. So if anyone's, like you keep saying, anyone's watching this wants an inspiration, we could use more like this, understanding the individual, especially the ones that are central figures in these stories. Like
Mhm.
pick MacDonald out of this whole mess,
Yeah.
is the best way
Yeah.
to put it, and centered that character. And I think that that's a
Mhm.
great thing to do because it helps us understand this thing that gets so clouded with all that stuff that accompanies these
Yeah.
divisions of the SS and all of that stuff that gets
Mhm.
lost, particularly with Canadians. Because again, I don't have to tell you with the whole Tim Cook argument that we didn't write our own history well enough and we have to step up.
Mhm.
I think that's the best. Is what we have to do. We have to do what you did and find the new way in. So for that, I thank you for that.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, it's good. It's good to have that. I'm keeping your MRP on my computer. That's going to be there. Hopefully, I get to use it for something. I'm sure I'll find
Thank
something.
you.
I always do. Stuff comes to me in crazy ways. But yeah, no. So thanks for coming on. I really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. I mean, I never really thought I would ever talk about it again post defense, really, other than very quickly explaining to new people that I meet
Yeah,
that, oh, I did history and this is what I did it on, kind of. But yeah, I think that this was amazing. It was so nice to speak about my work and to also learn more about other characters in this
yeah,
entire narrative. Yeah,
yeah.
I'm incredibly grateful.
Yeah, and that's why I love doing these live streams because the audience and great supporters of the channel are all here, and they just know so much, and they bring different
Mhm.
perspectives and different ways of thinking about this. Or, but like, what about this person? And you're like, oh yeah, oh, crap, I should, like, oh, there's
Yeah.
something I missed, or oh, damn it, I didn't think of that. That's why I think this is good because we get to just come up with new ideas and kind of mix things up. I think that's always best. So
Yes.
yeah, so people are really liking you coming on. So yeah, no, this is definitely interesting. Honestly, to be completely honest, I'm surprised more people haven't asked you to do something like this. Like this,
Thank
to be
you.
honest, because this is such a popular topic, right? Kurt Meyer,
Mhm.
if you put his name into YouTube or Google, and you're like, whoa,
Oh, yeah.
it's a bit overwhelming, and
Mhm.
usually in a bad way, where it's
Absolutely.
all about fancy kit instead of murdering people in a garden. Anyway, I'm honestly was surprised. So yeah, so thanks again. So I'm just
Thank
going to
you.
do a quick sign off and then we'll say goodbye together. All right.
Awesome.
So thanks everyone for watching. Thanks for those who came out live for the first live stream and show of the OTD Normandy month. We're going to be right back at it tomorrow. Like I already said, I don't know if Kevin's still watching. He was watching earlier. He is the next guest. So tomorrow also at 2 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. UK time, we're going to be talking about the Regina Rifles on D-Day and D+1. and everything they kind of did, because Kevin's been looking at that for years and years and years and years and has a great website and everything. We'll get into that tomorrow. And then we'll keep chugging along to Mark Milner on Monday, or D-Day, the anniversary of D-Day on the 6th. So again, if you're new to the channel, please subscribe, like the video, and leave comments down below about what you're thinking about these. I mean, we had several questions throughout the live stream that we weren't too sure on. So if you got some information, please share. That is always much appreciated and everything. So please do that. If you like the channel and all the work I'm doing and other things with OTD, please consider becoming a patron. Just a few bucks a month goes a long, long way to helping me keep things going and keeping this running. I've always need more support. So getting more patrons is a big, big part of that. So even the littlest bits help, and lots of benefits to be taken advantage of if you do become a patron. So thanks for coming on. Did you enjoy the show? Coming on, not too much pressure on you?
Oh, it was great. I think I stress myself out more than anyone else does. What can I say? Like I said to you earlier, I prepared for this like I was going to defense again. So
I told you not to be nervous. There's nothing to be nervous about. If you don't have an answer, it's not like you fail. Oh, we're gonna take that MO. We're gonna take that MA away from you. Oh, how dare you? No, it's just people want to hear how you come about this stuff. You know, for what you did, like how you did it, why. I mean, I like to know that. Like I already said, I love running this stuff, but I'm also a fan. I just like to know.
Yeah.
I'm also that curious person. I want to know things. So again, thanks again. I appreciate it. I'm glad it wasn't as stressful as you thought it was going to be.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. All right. So thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see everyone again tomorrow for chat about the Regina Rifles. So have a good rest of your Saturday, everybody.